Hey, my friend, have you ever realized how often criticisms and praises only really skim the surface of what they are talking about? For example, how often do we say something is simply good or bad? I know I'm guilty of this, and I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one. Now, there isn't really a problem with giving those answers. It just doesn't deliver what some people may be looking for when it comes to criticism or praise. For example, imagine you are looking for reviews on the latest movie, and the one you come across is best movie ever, so amazing, 5 stars. Notice how that actually tells you nothing unless you know the reviewer's tastes intimately. It should be describing any movie in existence and still be applicable. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, that there are some movies that no one could ever declare the best, but if it's the first one they've actually seen, then technically it is the best one. Besides, when we get down to it, moving pictures are pretty amazing, just seeing how far they've come in so little time. Still, we'll see things that get raved about with that sort of generic praise or blasted with this generic criticism, almost like the person reviewing them's opinions reflect this sort of objective standard. As a confession, I actually don't think I'm the best reviewer of things. Like, if I'm having fun playing a game, for example, I'll think it's great. And maybe someone will start to point out faults, and then I might start seeing those same faults too. And frankly, in my opinion, sometimes the story doesn't actually have to be a masterwork of philosophy or feelings. Sometimes the story can just be something to let your worries take a hike for a little bit while you enjoy some explosions. That being said, I do wonder what kind of movie can have a scene that is guaranteed to move me. I'm talking like every time I see a similar scene, there may be tears even if I've seen it like 20 times before. And yet, I end up leaving the theater wondering why I felt the movie as a whole was meh. So I probably am developing some standards, or at least my tastes are maturing with age and experience. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing probably depends on people's opinions, but it's still something I've noticed. And I think part of that is realizing just how powerful being specific about what we are commenting on can be. There's a trope by Edward Gibbon that I feel points out the difference between the generic and the specific real well. The rational pride of an author may be offended rather than flattered by vague, indiscriminate praise, but he should not, be indifferent to the fair testimonies of private and public esteem. It's an interesting trope, as we don't usually think of praise as something to be offended by. I mean, isn't praise a good thing? But think about the vague and indiscriminate parts for a minute. If something is vague, that generally means there aren't any details or specifics to it. So if someone is being vague about their praise for our work, then we can start to wonder if they really paid attention to what we did. Or maybe it's just that nothing actually made an impact or stood out to them, so they're just telling us that it's good. And then there is the indiscriminate part, where if all we hear is good things, we may start to wonder if there's something that people aren't actually telling us that they may be scared to or don't want to admit. Or maybe we just simply get the big head, thinking that we are simply the best and that there's nothing left to improve on. So then what's the difference between those kinds of praises and the so-called fair testimonies? Well, if something were to be a fair assessment of something, wouldn't it go into both what is good and bad about it? And in order to give that kind of assessment, someone has to have actively paid attention to what they are assessing. They can't just skim through it. They have to spend time and getting to know it in a sense. They have to understand it. Or, in other words, they have to actually know what they are talking about, even if it's just their opinion on it. Which is always important to keep in mind. And why listening to multiple perspectives or opinions is good, especially if you're looking to improve. Because not everybody who has an opinion on something is actually part of your target audience. and it didn't. So we can learn by paying attention to what people have found to be solid and also what they think needs some work. So that these assessments can let us know our strengths and weaknesses so that we get a better idea of how then to move forward. Which is actually probably the key point here, moving forward. Because no matter what anyone says about us or what we've done, we shouldn't let that keep us there, either basking in our glories or wallowing in our failures. Instead, we can choose to grow, which can sometimes look like further refining our strengths. So in story terms, maybe we find out that we are really good at dialogue. So instead of having just the main character, we add someone for them to play off of, making the back and forth more of a feature and getting better at it by practice. And then to grow with our weaknesses, there are actually two options. Sometimes we may decide to improve them. Keeping to the story example, if the pacing of the story needs some work, then we can either get better at telling what has been dragging on and isn't particularly necessary to the story, or we could also add in some needed info and setup to the plot to make it actually work. The other option is finding some way not to deal with those weaknesses. Maybe we can find a co-writer who excels where we are weak. Or, for example, we may not actually write good romances, but if everything else is solid, we can just cut the love story out in the future. Again, not every story needs this romance, in a sense. Just saying. Summed up, I think my point is that being specific about what we liked or don't like about something gives a clearer view to whoever did it in the first place, thus giving them a better idea on where they can go in the future. Because sometimes what seems like a major problem can actually be a pretty simple fix. At least these are my thoughts on this. But I'd love to hear about what you think, so why not share in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, you can like, subscribe, and share so that others can enjoy it as well. Anyway, I'm Jonah, and you've been watching Lions Made Media, where we celebrate stories and the lessons we learn from them. Talk to you later, and have a great rest of your day.